Hi, I'm Sheila, and I learned how to code when I was 36 years old. Not in a classroom and not in a fancy boot camp. I taught myself, and it was because I had an idea that wouldn't leave me alone. And within 3 years, I received a global honorable mention from NASA during the NASA Space Apps Challenge with one of the apps that we built. And then people ask me all the time, how did you do that? How did you go from zero coding to a NASA recognition? And here's what I discovered. People didn't actually want to know how I learned to code, nor did they want to learn how to code. They wanted to know how I broke down something that was so impossibly complex into easy steps that perhaps they could take. And that is the challenge that many experts face when they sit down for a podcast interview. You know all of your stuff inside and out, but the moment the microphone goes live, you are faced with a choice. Do you share everything that you know, or do you share what actually helps? Today, I'm going to show you how to turn your complex ideas into powerful podcast moments that people remember, share, and most importantly, act on. Here's what usually happens when experts become podcast guests. The host asks you about your expertise, and you light up. You have spent years mastering this. So you start explaining, and then you add context. Then perhaps you even mention the exceptions. You want to make sure you're thorough, accurate, complete. But then, somewhere in that explanation, you lose them. And you lose them not because you're not smart or qualified, and not because your information isn't valuable. You lose them because complexity without structure is just noise. I have recorded hundreds of podcast interviews, and I can tell you that the episodes that get the most engagement, the most shares, the most "I needed to hear this" messages are the ones not with the most information, but they're the ones where someone took a complex idea and made it feel possible. So how do you do that? How do you take everything you know and turn it into something someone can actually use? Well, there are 3 elements that transform complex ideas into powerful podcast moments. The first one is to have a single starting point. When I was learning how to code, for example, I didn't start with algorithms or data structures. I started with one question. Can I make a button that does something when I click it? That's it. One button, one action. Your listeners, they need the same thing. They don't need your complete system. They need the single next step that starts momentum. When someone asks you about your expertise on a podcast, resist the urge to give them the whole map. Give them the first turn. Give them something that proves that your bigger idea works. Second, use a recognizable pattern. Here's what I noticed with those podcast episodes. The most powerful moments weren't new information. They were familiar patterns explained in a new way. People don't need you to reinvent the wheel. They need you to show them that they're already holding the ingredients in them. They just don't know how to combine them. When you're on a podcast, look for the bridges. What does your complex idea remind them of? What do they already know that you can build on? Think about momentum in physics. An object in motion stays in motion. Well, that's not a new concept, but when you apply it to daily practices in your business or life, Suddenly, it becomes a framework that people can use. Same principle, new application. And third, remember, it's the practice and not the theory. And this is the big one. The difference between a forgettable interview and one that can change someone's trajectory. Theory is what you know. Practice is what you do. Every complex idea that you share on a podcast should come with a practice, an action that makes the idea real. When I learned to code, I didn't study theory for months and then build something. I committed to writing code every day, even if it was just for a couple of minutes. And some days it was terrible, some days the code broke, but it was the daily practice that turned the impossible skill into something I could actually do. And that's what your podcast audience needs from you. Not just to understand your idea, but to have a practice that they can do until it becomes their own. Let me show you how this can work in real time. Let's say you are a leadership consultant and the podcast host asks you, how do leaders build high-performing teams? Well, that's a massive question. You could talk for hours. You could probably talk about psychological safety, communication frameworks, performance metrics, hiring practices, organizational culture, and on and on and on. But here's how you can turn that into a powerful podcast moment using the 3 steps. The single starting point could have you say, the fastest way to build a high-performing team starts with 1 practice. And every meeting, asking each person one thing that's working and one thing that's not. Use a recognizable pattern, which is number 2. Think about the last time you had a great conversation with a friend. You didn't just talk about successes. You shared what was hard. And that is what builds trust. The same thing works with teams. And third, the practice over the theory could say, starting tomorrow in your next team meeting, take the last 5 minutes to go around the room. Ask one thing that's working, one thing that's not. Don't look for solutions yet, just listen. Do that for 2 weeks and watch what changes. You see the difference? It's the same expertise, the same leader, but now someone listening while they're driving to work knows exactly what to do when they get there. Now you might be thinking, but Sheila, if I just give them one simple practice, won't they think my work is too basic? Won't they undervalue my expertise? Well, here's what I've learned after 25 years of entrepreneurship, mentoring over 1,000 small business owners, and after building multiple companies. People don't hire experts because they're complex or complicated. They hire experts because they make complicated things simple. The podcast guests who get invited back, the ones who get clients from their interviews, the ones whose episodes get shared, they're not the ones who impress people with how much they know. They're the ones who gave people something they could actually do. And when I wrote my book, Momentum, I didn't write about daily practices because they sounded good. I wrote them because I had been using them for years to build businesses, learn new skills, and create real results. And the book itself, Momentum, well, that's proof that small, consistent actions compound into something significant. And your podcast interviews, they provide that same opportunity. They're not auditions where you perform your expertise. They're moments where you prove your ideas work by making them accessible enough for someone to try. So here's what I want you to do. Think about that next podcast interview that you have scheduled, or the one that you're hoping to get. Think about that question you always get asked, the one about your core expertise. And now ask yourself, what is a single starting point that someone could take today? What pattern from their own life does this connect to? And what's one practice that makes this real? Don't give them everything. Give them the one thing that starts momentum. Because the truth about powerful podcast moments is that they're not measured by how much you say, but by what happens after someone stops listening. Did they take action? Did they feel like change was possible? Did your complex idea become their next simple step? That's the moment that matters. That's the moment that builds your authority, and it creates the impact that you're actually after. So start building practices that create results. Not someday, not when you have it all figured out. Start with your very next podcast conversation. Thank you.